Here's a number for you, 94.7%. Remember it, because by the time this video ends, that number is going to completely destroy something you thought you knew for certain. Something you were taught in school, something that has been printed in textbooks, repeated in documentaries, and carved into the confident voice of every tour guide who has ever walked a group of tourists across the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Keep that number in your head. We will come back to it. Now close your eyes for just a second and picture the Great Sphinx, that enormous creature crouching in the Egyptian desert, body of a lion, face of a man, staring east across the sand toward the rising sun. You have seen it 1,000 times, on TV, in books, on postcards. It is one of the most recognized shapes in the history of the human race. And for over 100 years, the answer to who built it has been settled, sealed, and stored away. A pharaoh named Khafre ordered it carved around 2,500 years before Christ. Done. Case closed. Move along. But here's what nobody tells you. That answer has a crack in it. A crack that has been growing quietly for 30 years. A crack that geologists noticed, that researchers measured, that the mainstream scientific world dismissed and buried and refused to look at directly. A crack that, when an artificial intelligence was finally handed all the data with zero agenda and zero career to protect, cracked open so wide that the people in the room went completely silent. What Grok, the AI system built by Elon Musk's company XAI, found when it was pointed at the Great Sphinx is not just a different date. It is not just a debate about a few extra centuries. What it found, if it is correct, means that everything we think we know about the beginning of human civilization is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not off by a generation, wrong by thousands of years, wrong in a way that forces you to ask the question no history book has ever been willing to print. If someone built the Sphinx before civilization was supposed to exist, then what were they, and where did they go, and why, after 10,000 years, are we only now starting to hear what they were trying to tell us? Stay with me, because this story goes somewhere nobody expected. Let us start at the beginning, the real beginning. The official story goes like this. Around 4,500 years ago, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the Pharaoh Khafre was building his pyramid at Giza. His workers were quarrying limestone from the plateau to use as building material. They left behind a long, low ridge of rock jutting out of the desert floor, and someone, at some point during that construction project, decided to carve that ridge into the shape of a giant lion with a human face. The face, the textbooks say, is Khafre's own, a monument to the king, a guardian for his tomb. A few thousand men, copper chisels, wooden mallets, and decades of patient work, and there it stood, finished around 2500 BCE, the Great Sphinx of Giza. It is a clean story. It fits the timeline. It fits the other monuments around it. And for more than a century, that was enough. The debate was over before it started, and then a geologist went to Egypt, looked at the stone, and saw something that should not have been there. His name is Dr. Robert Schoch. He has a doctorate from Yale. In 1990, he traveled to Giza, not to search for mysteries, but simply to examine the geology of the limestone at the site. He was not a fringe thinker. He was not chasing conspiracy theories. He was a working scientist, doing what working scientists do, looking at rock and reading what the rock says. And what the rock said stopped him cold. Look at the body of the Sphinx, not the head, the body. And look at the walls of the deep pit that was carved around it to free it from the bedrock, the enclosure walls. Those walls are covered in deep, vertical rolling channels. Rounded grooves that run from top to bottom in long, undulating waves. Soft, smooth, curved erosion that looks almost like the surface of the sea frozen in stone. And the moment you know what you're looking at, you cannot unsee it. That pattern, those deep, rolling, vertical channels, is the signature of one thing and one thing only. Water. Sustained heavy rainfall running down a vertical stone face. Not for a season, not for a decade, but for centuries. Rain sheeting down that wall year after year after year, dissolving the soft limestone grain by grain, carving those grooves deeper with every rainy season. The problem is enormous, and it is simple. Egypt is a desert. It has been a desert for a very long time. The kind of sustained, heavy rainfall that carves limestone into those rolling patterns has not fallen on the Giza Plateau in any meaningful amount since long before Khafre was born, not since long before Egypt had pharaohs at all. The last time that kind of rain fell on that plateau on a regular basis was during a period geologists call the African humid period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, a time when the Sahara was not a desert but a landscape of grasslands, lakes, rivers, and trees, and that period ended approximately 7,000 years before Khafre ever sat on the throne of Egypt. Schoch's conclusion was this: if the body of the Sphinx shows water erosion from sustained rainfall, and if that kind of rainfall has not fallen at Giza for at least 7,000 years before the official construction date, then the body of the Sphinx must be older than 7,000 years before Khafre. It must have been standing there, already carved, already sitting in its enclosure, when those rains were still falling. That would push the construction of the Sphinx not to 2500 BCE, but to somewhere between 7000 and 1000 BCE at the very minimum. In other words, somewhere between 9 and 12,000 years ago. The mainstream archaeological community's response was swift and confident. They dismissed it. They said Schach was misreading the geology. They said the erosion could be explained by wind and blown sand and occasional flooding and chemical weathering. They said the monument simply could not be that old because there was no civilization capable of building it at that time. And there the argument sat, frozen in a stalemate, for 30 years. One side pointing at the watermarks in the stone, the other side pointing at the pharaoh in the history books. Neither side able to force the other to blink, until someone decided to stop asking humans. In 2024, a research team made a decision that sounds simple but had never really been tried before. They gathered every piece of data ever collected about the Great Sphinx, every erosion survey, every laser scan of the body and the enclosure walls, every climate reconstruction of the Eastern Sahara stretching back 50,000 years, rainfall models, weathering rates for limestone under different kinds of precipitation, seismic readings taken beneath the paws, ground-penetrating radar results from surveys going back to 1991, photographs from expeditions a century old, all of it, every number, every measurement, every data point anyone had ever recorded about that monument. And they fed it all to Grok, the artificial intelligence developed by XAI. They did not tell it which theory to support. They did not hint at which answer they were hoping for. They simply handed it the raw data and asked it to do one thing. Look at what is actually there and report, without flinching, whatever the numbers say. The machine had no tenure to protect, no decades of published papers it would have to quietly walk back, no funding committee it needed to impress, no reputation tied to any particular answer. It arrived at the problem exactly the way you want a scientist to arrive at a problem, but almost no human scientist can actually manage. Completely empty, completely neutral, caring only about what the evidence says. The first thing Grok did was measure the erosion, not estimate it, not eyeball it. It took the precise depth of every groove in the enclosure walls, the exact curvature of every rounded ridge, the vertical spacing of every undulation, and it cross-referenced that geometry against the known signatures of every erosive force that could possibly have acted on that stone. Wind-blown sand, salt crystallization, chemical weathering, occasional flooding, and sustained rainfall. Each of those forces leaves a different fingerprint on limestone. Wind-blown sand cuts horizontally. It scours along the ground, sharpest low where the sand is thickest, and it creates a rough, pitted horizontal texture. Salt crystallization flakes the stone, creating a crumbling, pockmarked surface. Flooding leaves different marks again. But rainfall, sustained rainfall running down a vertical face for centuries, leaves those deep, rolling vertical channels, soft at the top where the water first touches the stone, deeper and wider lower down where the flow has gathered speed and force, rounded and smooth in a way that no other process replicates. Grok compared the enclosure walls against all of it, and it returned a number. The erosion profile on the Sphinx enclosure matched the sustained rainfall signature with a confidence of 94.7%. The wind and sand explanation, the one the official story depends on entirely, came back at a small fraction of that, not zero, but statistically overwhelmed, not impossible, just vanishingly unlikely when measured against the actual shape of the stone. That is the number I told you to remember at the beginning. 94.7%. Not a guess, not an opinion. A probability calculation run by a system with no opinion to protect. But the machine did not stop there, because a confidence figure alone can be argued with. Numbers can always be reframed. So Grok asked the next question: how long, how many years of heavy rainfall does it take to cut grooves that deep into limestone of that specific hardness? This is not a philosophical question. It is a calculable one. Weathering rates for stone under known precipitation levels are measurable. Geologists have been doing it for decades. You take the depth of the erosion, the hardness of the rock, the estimated rainfall intensity based on climate records, and you calculate the minimum exposure time. When Grok ran those numbers against the rainfall models for the last wet period the Sahara ever experienced, it produced a floor, a minimum. The stone, it concluded, had been standing exposed to heavy rainfall for a period measured not in decades, but in many centuries. And the last time that rainfall fell on the Giza Plateau ended approximately 7,000 years before the pharaoh the textbook credits had even been born. The Sphinx would have had to be there already, fully carved, sitting in its enclosure, when those rains were still falling. Which means the machine was not offering an opinion about the builder. It was offering a minimum age, and that minimum age sat thousands of years below the answer everyone had agreed to accept. Then Grok turned its attention to something even more unsettling, something every tourist notices and nobody talks about: the head. If you have ever stood in front of the Sphinx and really looked at it, you have felt something quietly wrong without being able to name it. The body is enormous. Long, low, sprawling across the enclosure, the full flanks of a great reclining animal the size of a building. And sitting at the front of it is a head that looks, if you are honest, too small, out of scale, as though it belongs to a slightly different creature. Guides shrug it off. It has always been treated as a quirk of ancient artistry, an unusual proportion, nothing worth investigating. Grok did not treat it as a quirk. It measured the volume of the head, the volume of the body, the ratios a sculptor would naturally produce if the two were carved together as a single unified figure, and the numbers flatly disagreed with the idea that this head and this body were carved at the same time by the same people working from the same plan. The head is not just a little too small, it is dramatically too small. If the original figure had been carved in correct anatomical and artistic proportion, the head would have to have been several times larger than the one we see today, which raises a question so simple and so disturbing that once you hear it, it will not leave you. What if the head is not the original head? What if, at some point in the past, an older and much larger head was recarved, cut down, reshaped, the original stone removed, worked away, reduced to fit a new face, and what the machine noticed next made that possibility not just plausible, but measurable. The weathering on the neck and head is different from the weathering on the body below it. The body shows those deep, rolling vertical rainfall channels. The head and neck show a different kind of wear, sharper, drier. The surface texture you get from centuries of wind and blown sand scouring a face slowly in a dry climate. Two completely different weathering signatures on two parts of the same statue. And there is only one way that happens. The two parts were shaped at two different times. The body is ancient, standing in that enclosure, being eaten by rain from a climate that no longer exists. The head was carved later, in the dry world we know, probably by the Egyptians who found the old monument and put their pharaoh's face on it. The face of Khafre, if it is his face, was not the beginning of the Sphinx. It was a renovation, a repair job carried out on a monument that was already, even to the ancient Egyptians who touched it, unimaginably old. When Grok modeled what the original head would have looked like at the correct proportions for that body, the shape it reconstructed was not a human head. It was the head of a lion, a full, correctly scaled leonine head atop a leonine body. The Sphinx, before anyone touched it with a chisel to carve a pharaoh's portrait, was a lion, complete from nose to tail. And then the machine asked a question no human researcher had ever thought to ask in that form. It asked when a complete lion would have made sense, not artistically, but astronomically. The Sphinx faces due east, dead east, staring at the exact point on the horizon where the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox. This is not disputed. It is measurable to the arc minute, and it is precise. So Grok rewound the sky over Giza. It ran the precession of the equinoxes backward through thousands of years, equinox by equinox, watching what constellation sat on that eastern horizon at the moment of dawn, because the sky is not fixed, it moves. The whole celestial sphere drifts in a slow cycle roughly 26,000 years long, a motion so gradual that no single human life can feel it, but stone can record it across millennia. The question Grok asked was this: at what point in history did the constellation of Leo, the lion, rise on the eastern horizon at dawn on the spring equinox, directly in the line of sight of a monument that appears to have been a lion? The answer it returned was between approximately 10,500 and 8,000 years before the present. That is the age of Leo. The astronomical window when the lion in the sky rose where the lion on the ground was looking. A lion built on the ground, staring at a lion rising in the sky, at the exact moment when the sky shows a lion. That alignment is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the entire history of human construction, or it is intentional. And the probability of a randomly oriented monument accidentally pointing at its own symbol during its own astronomical age by pure chance is, according to the astronomer who reviewed the calculation, effectively zero. Someone around 10,000 years ago knew where the lion rose. They built a lion to watch it, and they built it to last. But here is where the story stops being about Egypt alone. Because a marker is only useful if it is marking something. A clock face without hands is just a circle. So Grok began to look outward. It looked at the ground beneath the Sphinx. Ground-penetrating radar surveys run by a team from Florida State University in 1996 and confirmed by newer synthetic aperture radar work completed in 2025 had already identified something extraordinary. A rectangular void roughly 12 meters by 9 meters, sitting about 5 to 8 meters beneath the Sphinx's front left paw. Not a natural fissure, not a crack in the limestone. Rectangular, geometric, structured the way nature does not make things without help. That void sits almost exactly on the equinox alignment axis. Whatever the Sphinx was looking at on the horizon has something buried directly beneath where it sits. As of this recording, that chamber has never been opened. Egypt's antiquities authorities have not permitted excavation of that specific void. The sealed door remains sealed. Then Grok widened the frame. It laid other ancient monuments onto the same map and began drawing lines between them. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, confirmed by radiocarbon dating to be at least 12,000 years old, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing, built by people who were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, but somehow dragged 16-ton carved limestone pillars across a mountaintop and assembled them into precise circular enclosures decorated with detailed animal carvings. The site was discovered in 1994, and it has been shaking the archaeological world ever since, because it is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and it should not exist. Not according to the history we were taught. Grok also found Stonehenge itself, aligned to the same solstice and equinox movements, constructed from stones dragged from quarries over 200 miles away. Sacsayhuaman in the Andes of Peru, where massive limestone blocks fit together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade into the seams, constructed with a technique and a precision no one has fully replicated. Puma Punku in Bolivia, where the stonework is so exact and so geometric that engineers still argue about how it was done with stone tools. Sites separated by oceans, by continents, by what should be thousands of years of unconnected history. When Grok mapped the angular relationships between these sites and measured what they shared, it did not find random variation. It found agreement. The same handful of angular relationships repeating from site to site, as though every one of these monuments had been placed against a single reference grid, a template that none of the people who built them should have known about because they were supposedly isolated from each other across impossible distances. A template implies an original. Someone drew the plan first. Everyone who came after was working from a copy of something they no longer fully understood. And then the machine produced its most disturbing finding. Because when it ranked all these ancient sites by the quality of their construction, the flatness of their surfaces, the tightness of their joints, the accuracy of their astronomical alignments, it expected to see the ordinary shape of human progress. Rough and clumsy at the start, getting more precise and refined as the centuries passed. Skill building forward through time the way it always does. That is the story we tell about ourselves. We start primitive and we get better. The data showed the exact opposite. The oldest structures were the most precise, the oldest joints were the tightest, the oldest alignments were the most accurate. And as the centuries moved forward, as civilization spread and expanded and supposedly advanced, the construction quality declined. The angles drifted. The stones stopped fitting as perfectly. The alignments became slightly less exact. The knowledge, whatever it had been, was not accumulating. It was leaking away. Each generation of builders was slightly further from the source, remembering slightly less of the method, copying the shape of the monument without fully understanding the mathematics that made it work. Grok described this in a single line. The precision curve is inverted. The builders were not learning. They were forgetting. Sit with what that means. It means the Sphinx is not the beginning of something. It is the end of something. It is the last competent echo of a knowledge that was already, 12,000 years ago, slipping through the fingers of the people who had inherited it. The pyramids themselves, as extraordinary as they are, may be an attempt to remember something their builders were already failing to fully grasp. Magnificent, but already a copy. We have always imagined that we are the peak of human achievement, the top of the mountain, the most advanced version of humanity there has ever been, looking back with something close to pity at the primitive people who scratched at the ground before us. But the data Grok assembled suggests something that is genuinely terrifying in its implications. We may not be the summit, we may be the recovery. A species slowly, painfully clawing its way back up toward a height it once stood upon and fell from. Staring at the monuments the survivors of that fall left behind, and calling them mysteries because we have forgotten that they were once instructions. And the geological record knows when it happened. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet went through something catastrophic and rapid. The last ice age ended not slowly but violently. Temperatures spiked. Massive ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet in a geologically short span of time. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years vanished beneath the ocean. In a world where advanced settlements would naturally form along coasts and river valleys, those coasts are now underwater. Anything built there, any evidence of whatever came before, is sitting under 100 meters of ocean. And on that geological scar, the monuments cluster. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried by whoever built it, buried intact, around 10,000 years ago, as though it was being preserved. The Sphinx was already old when the rain stopped falling. The sites with the tightest joints and truest alignments are the ones that point most directly back toward that catastrophe date. As though people who saw the end approaching did the only thing a dying civilization could do to send a message across time. They did not write it in a language, because languages die. They did not carve it in wood or paint it on walls, because wood rots and paint fades. They carved it into the one thing that outlasts everything, into stone, into the sky, into angles and alignments that a future civilization could only rediscover once it had rebuilt enough mathematics to notice them. A lion watching the dawn of its own age. A sealed chamber beneath its paws on the equinox line. A network of markers spanning the entire planet, all sharing the same hidden geometry. All of them saying the same thing in the only language that cannot be corrupted by time. We were here. We knew, and we are trying to warn you. Warn us of what? That is the part Grok could not answer. That is the part the stone has not yet been able to say, or the part we have not yet built the eyes to read. The machine found the message. It could not read the meaning, and maybe that is the most honest and the most frightening result of all. We built a mind with no agenda, no career to protect, no textbook to defend. We pointed it at the oldest question on Earth, and it came back not with a comfortable answer, but with a certainty. Something was here before us, something that knew things we are only now beginning to catch up to. And it went to enormous, deliberate, patient trouble to make sure that when we finally looked with the right eyes, we would see it. The Sphinx is still sitting there in the desert. It has been sitting there watching the same horizon for longer than civilization, as we define it, has existed. It never changed. It never moved. It was never hiding anything. We simply spent 100 years refusing to look at what it was actually showing us. And then we built a mind that had no reason to refuse, and that mind looked. And the stone spoke. The only question left is whether we are ready to listen to what it says next.